Hello and welcome to Topic 5. This is the second half of Chapter 4, where we will be learning about the Establishment Clause. And in this lecture, we're going to take a look at the formation of the Lemon Test. Like everything we've learned this semester, the court's interpretation of the Establishment Clause has changed over time. And so we saw when it came to incorporation that the court's interpretation of incorporation changed over time. We saw that obviously with the free exercise clause. And we're going to see that with many of the cases or subject areas moving forward throughout the course of the semester. The studying the Establishment Clause can be a little bit more frustrating than studying the Free Exercise Clause. With the Free Exercise Clause, we saw that we moved from a low standard that was set in Cantwell, the valid secular policy test, and then the court moves to a higher standard with the compelling interest least restrictive test that's created in Sherbert and applied in Yoder. And then we see that the court moves all the way back to the lower standard in Smith. So while you might not agree with the shifts that the court has made, or maybe you do agree with them, at least there's some continuity in understanding the test that they apply, even though that test has changed. That's not the same case with the Establishment Clause. The Establishment Clause, the court does create a test called the Lemon Test. We're going to learn about that in this lecture. But that the way that oftentimes they don't apply the Lemon Test in Establishment Clause cases. And in fact, some of the court is sort of openly hostile to the Lemon Test. And also, it just seems like there's less consistency. It's kind of hard to figure out the consistency in terms of where the court stands on the Establishment Clause, making it very difficult for lawmakers, okay? So studying the Establishment Clause jurisprudence can kind of drive you a little bonkers, okay? But just do your best as you're working your way through the cases. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to review the court's attempt to develop a workable understanding of the Establishment Clause. And we're going to start our journey there by taking a look at the framers, what the different attitudes regarding the framers were, what different attitudes did they hold in terms of interpreting the Establishment Clause. And even among the framers, there was a lot of differences in terms of what the establishment of religion constitutes. And then we'll take a look at major controversies, and we'll look at that in the next set of lectures. And so we'll, just this lecture is designed to get you familiar with the viewpoint of the framers and the Lemon Test. The next lecture will sort of be a potpourri of kind of landmark cases as it relates to the Establishment Clause. So let's go ahead and get started. As we enter into talking about the Establishment Clause, I want to make some distinctions between the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause that we just left last week in our studies. So the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. When it comes to the Free Exercise Clause, the Free Exercise Clause is a battle between individual action versus state action, okay? And so that the individual action is taking an action that is motivated by their religious beliefs, and it's coming up against a state action that impedes or impinges upon that religious exercise. So take the concrete example of Yoder versus Wisconsin. In Yoder versus Wisconsin, the Yoder family did not want to send their kids to school after 8th grade. That they felt that getting a worldly education in high school made it very difficult for them to practice their religion and to transmit their religious beliefs to their children, and that as a family they had a right to do that, and it's protected by the First Amendment. On the flip side of that, Wisconsin had a law in the books that said all kids in Wisconsin needed to go to school till they were 16, and so that state in action was impinging upon Yoder's religious practice, because that if he sent his kids to school until the age of 16, that would basically greatly endanger his religious practice, or that was his claim, and the court agreed with it. So Free Exercise Clause cases are about a balancing of interests between an individual action that comes up against a state action, and that the court tries to oftentimes figure out which action is more compelling. Is the action of the state more important than the individual's right to exercise their religious beliefs? The Establishment Clause is different than that. The Establishment Clause is oftentimes about a state action that is having an impact on a religious institution, okay? And so you're going to be reading a lot of cases about like a state action that where a state law is passed where kids who go to a public school will have to recite the Bible verses or recite a prayer. And so that's a state action that's having an impact on religious institutions because it's spreading or giving endorsement to a particular religious viewpoint, and that religious viewpoint is oftentimes embedded in religious institutions. It could actually be a state action that goes directly to a religious institution, potentially. And so the fact that religious institutions don't have to pay property taxes, the fact that they don't have to pay property taxes is basically a gift that the state is giving to that religious institution, because it's basically saying that you don't have to pay for the value of your property like all other people that live in the state. And then that comes head to head against an individual's right to be free from the intersection of church and state. So because the First Amendment says that Congress can make no law establishing respecting an establishment of religion, when taxpayer dollars are used to support a religious institution, or when a public law is used to promote or endorse a particular religious viewpoint, well, then the individual is saying, I have a right to be protected from that support. I have a right to be protected from that endorsement because of the First Amendment. And so the Establishment Clause is often a question about how much state impact is too much, right? At what point does the state's support of a religious institution or a religious doctrine violate the First Amendment Establishment Clause? And so that's what you should keep in mind as we're moving forward with these cases. Okay, so what constitutes an establishment of religion? What might we look towards to figure out what is, in fact, Congress establishing religion or the states? Well, perhaps we could look at the views of the framers, and they talk about that in your textbook, about we might get some insight into what the establishment of religion means if we look at the views of the framers. Unfortunately, or fortunately, and this is one of the problems with the intent of the framers, is that there were lots of different opinions when it came to what constituted an establishment of religion. In other words, how strict the separation between church and state should be. And so your textbook talks about the different viewpoints that the framers had. Some framers, in particular Jefferson and Madison, they felt that the separation between church and state should be very strict. There should be a strict separation. Sometimes people like to talk about the separation of church and state as a wall. And so Jefferson and Madison in their writings, you can see that they talk about a solid wall, that establishment of religion means that there can really be no intermingling between church and state. So this is what your textbook calls the separationist viewpoint, a strict separation between church and state. The other view is on, the other end of the spectrum. And so while Jefferson and Madison had a separationist point of view, other framers like Patrick Henry was supportive of providing a lot of support for religions. Patrick Henry introduced a bill in Virginia to use tax dollars to support the Christian religion, for example. And so the view 3 is the accommodationist position that interprets the establishment of religion as that the only thing that the First Amendment prohibits is actually establishing a state or national religion. So it only prohibits saying that the state religion of Wisconsin would be Catholicism, or that the national religion would be Episcopalianism. That's the only thing that the First Amendment prohibits from this third viewpoint, the accommodationist viewpoint. And then there's a second view that comes, and I put 1 and 3 first because the second view is somewhere in between. And somewhere in between says there is a wall that separates church and state, but it's kind of a porous wall. In other words, things can pass between church and state. And so what the view 2 focuses on is that church and state can interact, but the state can't favor one religion over another. Okay, so there can be some interaction of church and state, but that interaction has to be an interaction that benefits all religions, right? And doesn't give one benefit or one more support to one religion over another. You should keep in mind that the vast majority of the framers were fell into the view 2 and view 3. However, Jefferson and Madison play a very important role in framing our founding documents, so you might want to keep that in mind. And also keep in mind that the original draft of the Establishment Clause actually said, shall not establish a national religion. That was in there. Like, that was what was defining the establishment, that's what establishment of religion meant. But this isn't the draft that makes it into the actual Constitution and that's ratified to the states. Okay, so maybe establishment of religion is more than just prohibiting an establishment of a state or national religion. So some things to keep in mind. The separationist and accommodationist conflict that was present at the founding of our nation, or the framing of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, those camps are alive and well today. And they play a large role in sort of the interest groups that align and try to pressure the court when Establishment Clause cases, come into play. And Establishment Clause cases, as we know, we read an Establishment Clause case from 2017 in the textbook. And so there's a graph in your textbook that you should take a look at. Because as we know that interest groups, those are outside influencing groups, that they submit amicus curiae briefs to the Supreme Court and trying to make a case for why the Supreme Court should rule in an Establishment Clause case in a separationist point of view, or an Establishment Clause case in an accommodationist point of view. So that make sure that you take a look at the examples of separationist groups, such as the American Civil Liberties Union is a separationist group, compared to the accommodationist groups, such as the U.S. Catholic Conference in the United States. So there are interest groups alive and well today that basically still shows that there's a sort of an unsettled understanding of just what the establishment of religion means. Okay, so let's take a look at the lemon test. And the lemon test, it's a fork, see? Forks have prongs, and the lemon test has 3 prongs. And so the lemon test, it comes from a case called Lemon v. Kurtzman that you'll be reading about in your textbook, and we'll touch on briefly in the lecture. But there are so many cases in the textbook that, depending on you for reading those and then coming to our case studies office hours to discuss them if you want some more details. But Lemon v. Kurtzman is the case that establishes the so-called lemon test. And it is the test that the court uses sometimes to determine whether or not a law has violated the Establishment Clause. And there are three prongs to the establishment, to the lemon test. And each of the prongs springs forth from a specific case that you're going to be reading about in your textbook. And so let's take a look on the next slide at the cases that establish the 3 prongs. Okay, so prong 1, of the lemon test says that the law must have a secular legislative purpose. And that comes from the case Everson versus the Board of Education, 1947. It's a landmark case. After we get through talking about the 3 prongs of the lemon test, we're going to spend some significant time talking about Everson because it's such an important case. So for the law to be constitutional, it must have a secular legislative purpose. for a law to be constitutional, in other words, not violate the Establishment Clause, that prong two, the primary effect of the law must be one that neither advances or inhibits, stands in the way, it cannot be negative against religion. But the primary effect of the law must be one that neither advances or inhibits religion. The law must be neutral when it comes to religion. So it must have a secular purpose, and the law must be neutral. And the third prong, and then that comes from the School District of Abington versus Shemp. We'll just touch on that a little bit in our lecture today. But that's the mandatory Bible reading case. And then prong three is that, and that comes from the case Waltz versus the Tax Commission of New York, says that in order for a law to be constitutional, it cannot foster excessive entanglement between government and religion, right? So if the law, it could have a secular purpose and the primary effect could be neutral on religion, but if it's got the government all up in the business of religion, or if religion is all up in the business of government, then that's excessive entanglement. And that then would make the law unconstitutional, a violation of the Establishment Clause. Make sure that you read about Waltz v. Tax Commission of New York, because that's where that case, that third prong is developed. This is a case about a taxpayer who challenges the non-taxing, the fact that religious organizations are tax exempt. They don't have to pay property taxes, and that in the court it said that it is constitutional for religious institutions to be exempt from paying property taxes, and you can read about that in the textbook. And in fact, if we didn't exempt religious institutions from paying property taxes, it would actually get government way too up in the business of religion, like looking at their property records and seeing how much the value of their property was, etc. And then all these tests, so you get the three prongs in those three cases, and the test is articulated in the case Lemon v. Kurtzman. That's when all the three prongs of the test come together and the Lemon test is established. So let's take a look at Everson, because Everson is that first prong. It's an important case, not just because it establishes the first prong, but it's an important case in terms of the way that what constitutes an establishment of religion is articulated. So let's take a look at it. Okay, before we get into the facts of the case of Everson, let's take a look at why Everson is an important case. Everson is an important case because it's the first major Establishment Clause case that the court hears. The court doesn't hear a lot of Establishment Clause cases really until Everson, because there's a sense that the Establishment Clause doesn't apply to the states. And also there weren't a lot of instances where Congress was establishing religion or giving aid to religions. It was usually states that were doing that. And so since there was a sense that this part of the First Amendment didn't apply to the states, then people weren't bringing those cases to the Supreme Court because they didn't think the Supreme Court had jurisdiction over them. Everson is also an important case because it incorporates the Establishment Clause to the states. Okay, and look at the date, 1947. So the incorporation starts at the turn of the 20th century, and so this is about halfway through, and it opens up the gate for other people to bring their disputes over the Establishment Clause to the Supreme Court. So it's important for that reason. Everson is also an important case because it does such a great job of defining what constitutes the establishment of religion and why it's so important for us to have the religious clauses in our Constitution. And it gives us the first prong of the Lemon test. And then finally, when you're reading Everson, you're going to be like, man, this is such a separationist case. There's no way that they're going to find that this law is in fact constitutional. Of course, you're reading it and you're like, oh, well, this law definitely violates the Establishment Clause. So it's separationist in text, but it has an accommodationist outcome, which is sort of surprising. But then it also sort of sets the stage for future cases and sort of this difficulty in in dealing with the Establishment Clause cases that the court seems to have over its long history. All right, let's talk about Everson versus the Board of Education. As that picture indicates, this is a case that has to do with using public dollars to transport kids to school. The state of New Jersey had a law in its books that said that if school boards used public money and public transportation to get kids to public school, that they also needed to pick up the kids along that bus route and take them to their private schools, even if those private schools were religion. So in a way, the taxpayer dollars was going towards not just transporting kids to public schools, but the taxpayer dollars were also being used to transport kids to religious schools. So this case revolves around a town in New Jersey that had no high school. Okay. And so when it came time for kids the name of the town was Ewing, New Jersey. When it came time for the kids in Ewing, New Jersey to go to high school, they couldn't just get on a public bus to take them to the high school. So that since as such, the school board, they made a choice. And they said that they were going to reimburse parents for $40 for travel expenses that it takes to get your kid to the public high schools. And so they're going to use public dollars and give those to in the form of a voucher to offset the cost associated with transporting your kid to the public high school. But because of the New Jersey law, they also had to open that up to parents that wanted their kids to go to private religious schools. And so that the school board in the Ewing, New Jersey township, they said that there were 3 neighboring public schools that you could use, that you would get a voucher for to send your kid to make up the costs of transportation. And there were 4 Catholic high schools. And these Catholic high schools offered regular secular instruction, but also religious instruction as well. And so basically, parents who were sending their kids to both public and religious private schools would get a voucher from the taxpayers to offset the cost of transportation. And Arch Everson, a taxpayer in New Jersey, was angry about that. He thinks that law that uses taxpayer dollars to reimburse parents to send their kids to religious schools is unconstitutional and that it violates the Establishment Clause. And so those are the facts of the case that are surrounding the Everson versus the Board of Education. So what was the question before the court in this case? The question was, does reimbursing parents with taxpayer dollars for transporting their children to private religious schools violate the Establishment Clause? And in a 5-4 decision, there was a significant disagreement on the court. The court ruled that no, using taxpayer dollars to reimburse parents for transportation costs to go to a private religious school does not violate the Establishment Clause. They say that the First Amendment only needs to remain neutral. Here, the state does not contribute money to schools. New Jersey has not breached the high and impregnable wall between church and state. Okay, so let's look at the ruling in more detail. So Justice Black writes the opinion of the court, and he starts with examining why the Establishment Clause is in the Bill of Rights. The first thing he says is that the Establishment Clause is in the Bill of Rights because it protects the individual from harm. That joining church and state magnifies the power of both church and state. And so a church that maybe wasn't getting assistance from the state becomes more powerful. And also because the state is maybe favoring one religion over another, it can magnify its own power as well. And that when you join church and state and their power is magnified, that can result in religious conflict. That as one church becomes aligned with the power of the state and one church becomes more powerful and kind of can use the coercive power of the state to, potentially make people come to their church and find more adherents, that can lead to religious conflict, persecution, fear, coercion, right? And that we need the Establishment Clause because it protects people from that harm because it keeps church and state separate. Another thing that Justice Black speaks to about why the Establishment Clause is important is because he says that it protects the most important type of freedom, freedom of the mind. He says that forcing somebody to pay taxes to support religious beliefs they don't support is one of the gravest assaults on your liberty. And really think about that. What if you either have a religious belief or you have no religious belief at all, but your taxpayer dollars have to go to support a religion that you don't believe in, that is not a part of your religious beliefs, or if you are going to support religion in and of itself if you're a religious non-believer. That's really sort of making you participate in the support of something that really goes against, fundamentally what you believe and the sanctity and the freedom of your mind. And so that the Establishment Clause prevents that eroding of the freedom of the mind. I love the point that he makes too, is that true religious faith doesn't really need state support. That in fact, a lot of people would maybe see a strict separation of church and state as being anti-religious, but I think Black makes an argument for just the opposite. What he says is that separation of church and state makes the church stronger because they have to stand on their own 2 feet. They can't depend on the state to give them money. They can't depend on the state to help them get adherence to their religious viewpoint. They have to make their own case for that. And if their religious belief is strong and compelling and speaks to people, then adherents will come and join their church. And so that, in fact, giving church state support is sort of making it seem as if they need it, when in fact, true religious faith does not. And so he makes a case for why the separation of church and state is not only good for the individual's freedom of thought, but it's also good in terms of the freedom of thought and the freedom to believe that a church itself has. The next thing that Justice Black does is he goes on to define what it constitutes an establishment of religion. And many cases harken back to Everson because he does such a great job defining what constitutes an establishment of religion. He says that the state or the federal government cannot establish a church. It can't pass a law that aids one or all religions. It can't force somebody to go or stay away from church or to profess a belief. It says that no tax of any amount can be levied to support religious activities or institutions. I've got that in red because so many cases revolve around that tax support. States can't participate in the affairs of any religious organization, and that there does need to be this wall of separation between church and state. And this is what he means by that wall. And it basically says that any law that enters into this forbidden territory of these things he's enumerated as constituting an establishment of religion is unconstitutional. So oftentimes Establishment Clause cases will sort of look at this forbidden territory and say, hey, is the law trying to establish a church? Is the law trying to give aid to one or all religions? Is the a tax being used to support a religious activity or an institution? And if it does, it's entered the forbidden territory, and thus it is an unconstitutional law. Up to this point, as you are reading Everson, you're probably thinking, man, this New Jersey law is going to go down as entering the forbidden territory. But that is not what happens. When asking the question of whether or not the New Jersey law is constitutional, Justice Black and 5 members of the court say, yes, it is constitutional. Why? What he says is transportation to school is promoting the general welfare of citizens. And that is a secular intent. And so the goal of this law is to not promote a religion, but it's to promote a secular legislative purpose of the state. And that's the general welfare of its citizens. He says that might more students attend Catholic school with this law? And he says, yeah, it is true that maybe more kids will attend Catholic school. But he says that transportation is really no different than fire department protecting a Catholic school or a religious school, the police department protecting that school like they would any other school, or if pipes burst, then the sanitation officials will come in and fix those pipes. And so when the state does those things with the dollars, they are providing a broad secular purpose for the welfare of all people, and the transportation falls into that category. And so it says that the state must be neutral to religion, not adversarial. So he actually says that if they denied students the right to use the public buses to get to their religious schools, or to reimburse them for transporting them to the religious high schools, you're actually being hostile to religion. And that because you're going to point out religion and say that you don't get this benefit when everybody else does. And so he actually says that that this law, the way it's written, is neutral, and the Constitution demands that laws are neutral when it comes to religion. Now, that's 5 people on the court. Make sure to read the dissents, okay? Because the dissents are really compelling. The dissent is basically saying that this law is unconstitutional because it makes a taxpayer pay taxes that go directly to a religious school, basically. They say that the state can use taxes to reduce poverty and unemployment, but they can't use tax dollars to aid religion, and that is what this New Jersey law does. And he even says that in the ruling itself, it says you can't use taxes to support religion. And so the dissents really see the contradictory aspects of Black's majority opinion. But make sure that you take a look at the dissents because they're really good. So as you're thinking critically about Everson versus the Board of Education, I think sometimes it helps, although that you can see good points in Justice Black and Justice Jackson. And I think definitely reasonable people can disagree about whether or not this New Jersey law is in fact unconstitutional. But who do you see yourself siding with more, Justice Black or Justice Jackson, who writes the dissent? If you side with Justice Black and say, it's okay to provide taxpayer dollars to bus kids to parochial religious schools, how would you feel about laws making public schools provide secular textbooks to religious schools? And so not just busing somebody, but actually saying, hey, school board, you need to use taxpayer dollars, not just for the textbooks for the public schools, but the secular textbooks that are teaching like math and science and those sorts of things to religious schools. Would you be okay with that? Or is that going too far? And is that a violation of the Establishment Clause? What about using taxpayer dollars to pay part of teachers' salary, that the teachers who work in religious schools? And so now you'd only pay the salary as it associates with teaching the secular subjects at the religious school, but they're still, working, these teachers are still working in this religious school. Is that a violation of the Establishment Clause? And make sure that you read the Zellmer case about the vouchers. What about using taxpayer money for vouchers to give to parents to send them to religious schools? Make sure you read the vouchers case because that is a very interesting case as well. We're just focusing on Everson and the first prong of the Lemon test because we have limited time in these voiceover PowerPoints. So I will leave it to you to read the Shemp case and the Lemon v. Kurtzman case that articulates the Lemon test. There are 2 pictures there to give you a sense of what these 2 cases are about. On the left, Shemp is about the Pennsylvania law that says that each start of the public school day will start with a Bible reading. And so that questions whether or not a state law that mandates Bible reading at the start of a school day is unconstitutional. And they find that it is in fact unconstitutional and gives us the second prong of the Lemon test, saying that it's unconstitutional because it advances religion by having the Bible readings. And then on the other picture, that's a Lemon test, the case, the Lemon v. Kurtzman. That is a case about state dollars being used to purchase secular education in non-public high schools, okay, in Catholic schools, as the picture suggests. And as you'll find, they find that that is unconstitutional, because in part because it excessively entangles the state and the religious institution, thus creating and applying the third prong of the lemon test. All right, thanks for your time and attention, and I will talk to you again soon in our second lecture.